Shadows of the Past. The summer sun bore down on Margaret Scott as she made her way through the winding paths of Holy Siler Cemetery. The brightness of the day felt incongruous with the somber weight pressing on her heart. She gripped a single lily, her late husband Tucker's favorite flower, and each step felt heavier as she approached the headstone bearing his name. Her heart, hollowed by grief and confusion, beat with a slow, aching rhythm. Tucker Scott had been many things to her: a husband, a friend, a protector, and a rock. But now, with his grave freshly dug and his reputation in tatters, she found herself questioning everything she thought she knew about him. He'd been a police officer for over 2 decades, serving their small town with pride and dignity. Yet in the end, his name had been sullied. Tucker had died under a cloud of suspicion, his integrity marred by allegations of corruption. They'd refused him an honorable burial, stripping him of the police honors he'd earned through years of service. Margaret knelt by the grave, placing the lily on the newly turned soil. Her hands trembled as she brushed her fingers over his name engraved on the stone. "Tucker," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Did you do the things they say? Did you betray your oath, betray us?" The wind swept through the trees, rustling the leaves in a sound that seemed almost like a whisper in response, but it offered no answers. Margaret closed her eyes, feeling a tear slip down her cheek. She wanted to remember Tucker the way she'd known him, the way he'd been to her. But doubt gnawed at her heart, unraveling the memories of their life together. She was alone at his grave. The ceremony had been small, only a few friends and neighbors who dared to attend. Even their children hadn't come, unable to reconcile the father they loved with the man painted as a criminal. The priest had offered his condolences, but even he had seemed uncomfortable, casting glances around as though he feared being associated with Tucker's memory. As she knelt there, Margaret felt the familiar ache of loneliness settle over her. For the past few days, she had found herself thinking that this was some twisted nightmare from which she would soon awaken. But standing there in front of his grave, the cold finality of death and disgrace felt more real than ever. Just as she was about to rise, Margaret heard the soft crunch of footsteps behind her. She turned, expecting to see the cemetery's caretaker, Ode Johnson, making his rounds. But instead, a little girl stood there, her small frame almost swallowed by the space around her. She couldn't have been older than 9 or 10, her skin a deep brown that gleamed under the harsh sunlight. She wore a faded yellow dress that hung loosely on her, and her hair was pulled back in a pair of uneven braids. The girl's eyes, wide and curious, were fixed on Margaret. There was something oddly haunting in her gaze, something that made Margaret's breath catch in her throat. She couldn't remember seeing this child before, but there was an unsettling familiarity in her posture, in the quiet intensity of her stare. "Hello, sweetheart," Margaret said softly, managing a small smile. "Are you lost?" The girl shook her head, her eyes never leaving Margaret's face. "No, ma'am," she replied in a voice so soft it was almost a whisper. "I came to see you." Margaret's smile faltered. "To see me? I don't believe we've met." The girl nodded solemnly. "I know. But I knew him. Your husband. Mr. Tucker." She glanced down at the grave, her expression unreadable. Margaret's heart skipped a beat. "You knew Tucker?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. She hadn't seen Tucker with any children outside of their own, and this girl was too young to have been one of his former students from his days as a community youth mentor. The girl nodded again, this time with a gravity that seemed beyond her years. "He was nice to me," she said simply. "He helped me when I was scared." Margaret felt a pang of confusion, mixed with a flicker of hope. Perhaps this child could help her understand the parts of Tucker's life that had remained hidden from her, the parts that had been twisted by the accusations that had come out after his death. She gestured to the ground beside her, inviting the girl to sit. "What's your name, dear?" Margaret asked gently as the girl settled beside her. "My name's Elara," she replied, her small hands folding neatly in her lap. She glanced at the grave and then back at Margaret, her gaze steady and unwavering. Your husband. He was a good man. He saved me. Margaret's throat tightened. Saved you, she echoed. How did he save you, Elara? The girl took a deep breath, as though gathering courage. There was a bad man, she began slowly, her eyes distant. He used to come around where I lived. He was scary. I don't think anyone else noticed him, but I did. And one day, he tried to hurt me. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine, her hand moving instinctively to clasp Ilara's. The girl's fingers were cold, despite the heat of the day. Go on, sweetheart, she encouraged softly, though her heart was pounding. Ilara looked down at their joined hands, her voice trembling slightly as she continued. I ran away that day, but I was so scared, I didn't know where to go. I hid in an alley, and that's where he found me, your husband. He told me I was safe, that he wouldn't let anyone hurt me. Margaret's heart swelled with a mixture of pride and sorrow. This was the man she remembered, the Tucker who had dedicated his life to protecting others. But the joy she felt was tinged with bitterness. If Tucker had been so honorable, why had his reputation been dragged through the mud after his death? Ilara paused, glancing back at the headstone with a look of profound sadness. After that, he would visit me sometimes, just to check if I was okay. He never told anyone. He said he was my friend, and that he'd be there if I ever needed him. Margaret squeezed Ilara's hand, her eyes filling with tears. He was a good man, she murmured, almost to herself. I knew he was. The girl nodded. But something happened. I don't know what, but he stopped coming. I waited for him, but he never came back. Margaret's heart clenched, the pain of Tucker's absence echoing in Ilara's story. She swallowed hard, trying to steady her voice. He had a hard time, Ilara. Some people said he did bad things I know in my heart he would never do. Ilara looked up at her, her eyes filled with a fierce determination that startled Margaret. They're wrong. He was a hero, but I think he was trying to help someone else before he couldn't come anymore. Margaret's mind raced, piecing together Ilara's fragmented story. Could it be that Tucker had been involved in something dangerous, something he couldn't speak about? She remembered the whispers around town, the way his colleagues had avoided eye contact at the funeral. The police report had labeled his death as a tragic incident, the result of a reckless action. But Margaret knew Tucker was never reckless. Ilara, she began, her voice shaking. Do you know anything else? Anything about the man who hurt you, or what Tucker might have been doing before he left? The girl hesitated, biting her lip. There were people, she said slowly. People who didn't want him to help me. I don't know their names, but he told me not to trust anyone, not the people who said they were on his side, and not even the people who looked like friends. Margaret's mind spun. Her heart ached as she looked at Ilara, who had been so young and vulnerable, protected only by a man who was now gone. And suddenly, the weight of her grief was joined by a fierce determination. She couldn't let Tucker's memory be tarnished by lies. Whatever he had been involved in, whatever secrets he'd kept, she would uncover the truth. She wrapped an arm around Ilara, holding her close as they sat in the quiet cemetery. The child had brought a spark of purpose back into her life, a reason to move forward. Tucker had saved Ilara, and now, in some small way, Ilara was saving Margaret. As they sat together, the silence of the cemetery was no longer filled with sorrow, but with a resolute determination. Margaret would find out what had happened to her husband, and she would clear his name. And perhaps, in the process, she would help heal the wounds left behind in this little girl's heart as well as her own. Pieces of a hidden life. Margaret Scott couldn't shake the words of the little girl who had come into her life like a quiet storm. Even after she left the cemetery that day, with Ilara's confession ringing in her ears, Margaret felt as though her world had shifted, as if the ground beneath her had split open to reveal a dark, mysterious chasm. Ilara's story hinted at secrets Tucker had never shared, secrets that cast his death and his life in an entirely new light. She drove home in a daze, her fingers clenching the steering wheel, mind swirling with questions. Tucker had been helping this girl in secret, protecting her from people who wanted to harm her. But who were these people? Why had Tucker kept it all hidden, even from her? And how much of the life they had built together had been shadowed by this hidden world he seemed to have inhabited? By the time Margaret reached her small, white clapboard house, dusk had begun to settle, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange. She parked in the driveway, resting her head on the steering wheel, breathing deeply to calm herself. The familiar sight of home should have brought her comfort, but tonight it only reminded her of the emptiness Tucker had left behind. As she entered the house, her eyes instinctively drifted to the wall where Tucker's police commendations and service awards were displayed. They were simple but meaningful tokens, a testament to a man she had believed was honorable and true. But now, every one of them seemed to mock her, to question her understanding of the man she had loved. Determined to find answers, Margaret decided to start in the one place that Tucker had always guarded most closely, his study. She'd rarely entered it when he was alive, respecting his privacy and the need for a sanctuary where he could unwind after long, difficult days on the force. But now, that room was hers to explore. Perhaps, within its four walls, she might uncover the truth that Tucker had taken to his grave. She turned the doorknob slowly, pushing open the door with a creak that echoed through the house. The study was dim and silent, a faint scent of old books and leather lingering in the air. Shelves lined the walls, filled with thick volumes on law, criminology, and historical cases. Tucker had always been a reader, a lover of knowledge and justice, someone who prided himself on knowing the law inside and out. Margaret took a deep breath and began to examine the room with fresh eyes. The desk, a heavy oak piece that Tucker had inherited from his father, dominated the center of the room. Its surface was cluttered with stacks of paperwork, a few pens, and a half-empty coffee mug that had gathered dust in his absence. She ran her fingers over the papers, lifting them one by one, scanning for anything that might reveal a clue. Most of the documents were mundane: work schedules, police reports, a few scribbled notes on cases he had been working on. But then she noticed something unusual. Tucked between the pages of an old case file was an envelope, marked with the initials E.S. Margaret's breath caught as she recalled Elara's name. Could it be? She carefully unfolded the envelope and found a handwritten note inside, written in Tucker's bold, confident script. "E.S. needs protection, dangerous connections. Can't involve anyone else. Meeting planned. If anything happens to me, she'll need a friend. M." Margaret's heart hammered in her chest as she read and reread the note, trying to make sense of it. E.S. had to be Elara, and Tucker's words suggested he had been meeting with someone dangerous, someone connected to this mysterious girl. And if Tucker was right, if his life had been taken because of these connections, then his death wasn't a simple accident or the result of recklessness. It was something darker, more sinister. Tucker had written, "If anything happens to me, she'll need a friend." Margaret felt the weight of his words settle over her, a burden he had left for her to bear. He had known he was in danger, and he had chosen to protect this girl even if it cost him everything. A surge of both pride and sadness overwhelmed her. This was the man she had loved, a man who put others before himself, who had risked his life for someone else's child. A new determination filled her heart. She wouldn't let Tucker's sacrifice go unanswered. She would find out what had happened to him, and she would protect Elara as he had wanted. This was her duty now, the last act of love she could perform for her husband. The next day, Margaret returned to the cemetery, hoping to find Elara again. She wandered through the rows of headstones, calling her name softly, but there was no sign of the little girl. The cemetery was quiet, the only sounds the soft chirping of birds and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Margaret's shoulders slumped with disappointment, but she resolved to return every day if necessary. She couldn't give up now. As she turned to leave, she noticed a familiar figure walking toward her. It was Ode Johnson, the cemetery caretaker, with his usual slow, methodical gait. His face broke into a gentle smile when he saw her. "Back again, Mrs. Scott?" he asked, his voice tinged with kindness. "Can't say I blame you. It's not easy letting go." Margaret managed a small smile. "Thank you, Mr. Johnson. It helps to be here, close to him. It feels right." Ode nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. "Your husband was a good man, ma'am. Always treated everyone with respect, even the folks most others ignored." Margaret's heart warmed at his words. "Did you know him well, Mr. Johnson?" Ode hesitated, then nodded. "Well enough, I suppose. He'd sometimes stop by when he was on patrol, just to check in, make sure everything was all right here. Always made time to talk, even if he was in a hurry. Not many folks would do that." She took a deep breath, sensing an opportunity. "Mr. Johnson, did you ever see him with a young girl? A girl named Elara?" Ode frowned thoughtfully, scratching his chin. "Can't say I recall, ma'am. But then there's a lot that happens here, and I'm just one man keeping watch. Why do you ask?" Margaret bit her lip, debating how much to reveal. Finally, she decided to be honest. "I met a girl here yesterday. She told me that Tucker had helped her, protected her. And I think he was in danger because of it." The caretaker's face darkened. "Danger, you say? That's a hard thought, Mrs. Scott. I don't know much about that sort of thing, but if your husband was involved in something like that, I hope you find the answers you're looking for." She thanked him and returned to her car, feeling a mix of hope and frustration. Ode's words had been kind but offered no concrete leads. However, she had learned something important. Tucker had made a habit of checking on people, of caring for others even when no one else was watching. That was why he had reached out to Elara, even though he knew the risks. Determined to keep searching, Margaret decided to visit the police station, the place that had once been Tucker's second home. She knew it would be difficult to face his colleagues, many of whom had turned their backs on him after his death. But if there was even a chance that someone there knew something, she had to take it. As she stepped into the station, memories flooded back. She remembered bringing him lunches on long shifts, the way he would greet her with a tired but warm smile. Now, the familiar faces of his fellow officers seemed cold and distant, their expressions guarded as they saw her. She felt like an outsider, an unwelcome reminder of a scandal they wished to forget. Margaret approached the front desk, where a young officer glanced up at her, his expression blank. "Can I help you, ma'am?" "I'd like to speak to Detective Daniels, if he's available," she said, keeping her voice steady. The officer raised an eyebrow. "Detective Daniels is busy, but I can see if he's willing to meet with you." "What's this about?" "It's about my husband, Tucker Scott," she replied firmly. The officer's face softened slightly, and he nodded, disappearing down the hallway. A few moments later, Detective Daniels emerged, his face a mixture of sympathy and discomfort. "Mrs. Scott," he said, his voice low, "I wasn't expecting to see you here. I thought we'd gone over everything after his passing." Margaret took a deep breath, summoning her courage. "Detective, I don't think I know everything. I recently met someone, a little girl named Elara. She told me that Tucker was protecting her, that he was trying to keep her safe from someone dangerous." Daniel's face stiffened, and he cast a quick glance around before motioning for her to follow him into a private office. Once inside, he closed the door and leaned against the desk, his expression guarded. "Mrs. Scott," he began, choosing his words carefully, "there are things that were never made public. Tucker was a good man, but he was also under a lot of pressure. He found himself in situations where he had to make hard choices." Margaret felt her heart tighten. "What do you mean? What kind of choices?" Daniels hesitated, looking down at the floor. "Your husband was investigating a ring, a dangerous group involved in trafficking and other criminal activities. He was close to exposing them, but he knew he couldn't trust everyone on the force. There were whispers that some officers were compromised, that they were working with these people instead of against them. Margaret's blood ran cold. Are you saying Tucker's death was no accident?" Daniels met her gaze, his eyes filled with regret. "I don't know, Mrs. Scott. All I know is that Tucker was getting close to something big. And then, well, you know what happened. If he was helping that girl, Ilara, it may have been part of something larger than we realized." Margaret's mind reeled. Her husband hadn't been disgraced or reckless. He had been a hero, fighting against a darkness that reached far deeper than she had imagined. As she left the station, a new resolve filled her. Tucker's life and reputation had been sacrificed for the truth, and now it was up to her to bring that truth to light. As she walked back to her car, Margaret felt Tucker's presence with her, like a silent companion guiding her forward. She would find out what had happened, not only for herself but for Ilara, and for the man she had loved so deeply. This was her mission now, and she would stop at nothing to see it through. Into the shadows. The world around Margaret had shifted, as if a veil had been lifted, revealing a reality darker than she had ever imagined. Tucker had been a man of principle, a man who'd believed in justice and integrity. And now she knew he had died not because he had fallen from grace, but because he had dared to challenge a corrupt system. The station's whispers of compromised officers and hidden alliances had turned her once safe, familiar town into a place of suspicion and danger. Margaret returned home, feeling a newfound urgency gnawing at her. She couldn't rest until she understood the full story behind Tucker's death. The weight of his last words in that note still pressed on her mind. "If anything happens to me, she'll need a friend." Ilara, the little girl who had looked up to Tucker as a savior, was somehow at the center of this tangled web. And now, without Tucker, she was vulnerable. With renewed determination, Margaret sat in Tucker's study, surrounded by the physical remnants of his life. Her eyes fell once again on the dusty stacks of paperwork. She'd already found the note, but she felt there was more here. Some final message Tucker had left, trusting that one day she might uncover it. Margaret began going through the files, one by one, searching for anything that might provide answers. She worked methodically, scanning pages, shuffling through stacks, and pausing over notes scrawled in the margins. Hours passed, and her fingers grew sore, her eyes strained from the constant search. But she pressed on, unwilling to let fatigue deter her. Finally, her patience paid off. As she reached the bottom drawer of the desk, hidden beneath an old, worn-out case file, she discovered a slim black notebook. It was plain, unmarked, and didn't appear to belong with the rest of the police files. Margaret's hands trembled as she opened it, her pulse quickening with anticipation. Inside were Tucker's personal notes, written in his familiar handwriting. The first few pages contained seemingly mundane observations, bits and pieces about cases he'd worked on. But as she turned the pages, the entries became more cryptic, filled with short phrases and code names that she didn't recognize. She read slowly, absorbing each word, trying to piece together the clues he had left behind. One phrase stood out among the rest, written in bold, underlined twice: "The Velvet Fox." Beneath it, Tucker had scribbled the words "unseen hand." "Trust no one, not even the familiar." Margaret frowned, rolling the name around in her mind. The Velvet Fox. It sounded like a code name or an alias. Perhaps it was the leader of the criminal ring Tucker had been investigating, or maybe a key figure within the organization. Whoever or whatever it was, Tucker had thought it important enough to emphasize. And the warning that followed made her heart skip a beat. Trust no one, not even the familiar. Did Tucker believe that people close to him were involved? Had he begun to question even those he had once trusted? The implications made her feel nauseous, and she put a hand to her mouth, fighting the rising wave of dread. Tucker had always been careful with his trust, cautious with his friendships. For him to write such a warning meant that he must have felt completely isolated, vulnerable. And yet, he had continued his investigation, even knowing the risks. Margaret flipped through the remaining pages, but the entries became sparser, almost fragmented, as if Tucker had been writing in haste. Some pages contained single words, others lists of locations and dates, all of them without context. It was clear that he had been onto something big, something dangerous. But the notebook alone didn't provide the full picture. With a sigh, she closed the notebook and leaned back in the chair, her mind racing. The velvet fox was a lead, but it wasn't enough. She needed more information, a connection that would bring everything together. And there was only one person who might be able to help her now: Ilara. Margaret decided to return to the cemetery the next day, hoping to find the girl again. She spent a restless night, her dreams filled with shadowy figures and Tucker's voice calling out to her, warning her to be careful. When morning finally came, she dressed quickly, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and fear. She grabbed the notebook and slipped it into her bag, determined to bring it with her in case Ilara recognized anything within its pages. As she entered the cemetery, the air was thick with the scent of freshly cut grass and damp earth. She made her way to Tucker's grave, her eyes scanning the surrounding area for any sign of the girl. At first, the ground seemed empty, the only movement the gentle sway of the trees in the morning breeze. But then, as she approached the grave, she caught sight of a small figure sitting cross-legged behind a nearby headstone. "Ilara," Margaret called softly, not wanting to startle her. The girl looked up, her wide eyes meeting Margaret's with a mixture of curiosity and relief. She rose to her feet, brushing dirt from her faded yellow dress as she came forward. "You came back," Ilara said, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret nodded, giving her a gentle smile. "I needed to talk to you again, sweetheart. There are things I need to understand. About Tucker, about what he was doing for you." Ilara's face grew serious, and she nodded, her gaze steady. "I'll tell you what I know, but there's still things I don't understand either. Mr. Tucker, he didn't tell me everything." Margaret took a deep breath, pulling the notebook from her bag and holding it out for Ilara to see. "Do you recognize any of this, especially this name, the Velvet Fox?" Ilara's eyes widened, and she took a step back, her face paling. "The Velvet Fox. Mr. Tucker warned me about him. He said he was a very dangerous man, that he was behind everything." Margaret felt a shiver run down her spine. "Behind everything? Do you mean the bad things happening in town?" Ilara nodded, her small hands clenching at her sides. "The Velvet Fox has people everywhere. Mr. Tucker said that some of them even wear uniforms, that they pretend to be good but work for him in secret. He told me never to trust anyone who seemed too nice. That's why he came alone when he helped me. He said he couldn't tell anyone, or they'd come after both of us." Margaret's heart broke for the girl. She was so young, and yet she had been forced to live in fear, to see the world through a lens of suspicion and caution. Tucker had tried to shield her, to give her a sense of safety, but his own life had been the price he paid for that protection. "Ilara," Margaret said gently, "do you know where the Velvet Fox might be? Or anyone who works for him?" Ilara looked down, her expression clouded with doubt. "There's a place," she murmured. "Mr. Tucker took me there once, but owned it from far away. He said it was dangerous, that we couldn't go inside. It's an old factory by the river. People say it's abandoned, but Mr. Tucker said it was a lie, that it was where bad things happened." Margaret's mind raced. An abandoned factory by the river. It sounded like the perfect place for someone like the Velvet Fox to operate, hidden from prying eyes. She knew of the place. It had been closed down years ago after a fire had gutted part of the building. Since then, it had become something of an urban legend in town, a place where teenagers dared each other to go at night, but no one actually believed anyone still worked there. "Ilara, thank you," Margaret said, squeezing the girl's hand. "You've been very brave to tell me this. I don't want you to worry. I'll make sure no one hurts you." The girl looked up at her, her expression a mixture of hope and fear. Are you Are you going to stop the velvet fox? Margaret hesitated, the enormity of the task weighing on her. But then she thought of Tucker, of the sacrifices he had made, of the man he had been and the justice he had fought for. She couldn't walk away now. Whatever lay ahead, she would face it, for Tucker, for Ilara, and for the truth. Yes, she said firmly. I'm going to stop him. But I need you to stay safe, Ilara. Don't come to the cemetery for a while, all right? Just lay low and stay away from strangers. Ilara nodded, her eyes wide with understanding. Margaret watched her go, her small form disappearing among the headstones, a silent figure carrying the weight of secrets far too heavy for her young shoulders. As Margaret returned to her car, she knew what her next step had to be. She would visit the factory by the river, but she wouldn't go alone. She needed someone she could trust, someone who would believe her and help her bring the Velvet Fox's dark empire to light. Her thoughts turned to Danny, Tucker's old partner, the only person who had shown a willingness to question the official story. Margaret took a deep breath, steeling herself. She would go to him, show him the notebook, and tell him everything she had learned. Together, they would seek justice for Tucker and for all those whose lives had been twisted by the reach of the Velvet Fox. As she drove away from the cemetery, Margaret felt a fire ignite within her, a purpose that was both terrifying and empowering. She was no longer simply a grieving widow. She was a woman on a mission to unravel the shadows her husband had fought against, even at the cost of his own life. The factory lay waiting, a dark relic on the edge of town, holding the secrets that had claimed Tucker. Margaret would face it head-on, and she would not stop until the truth was laid bare, no matter what it might cost her. Allies in the darkness. Margaret drove straight to Danny's apartment, her mind racing. She knew what she was about to ask him was no small favor. She was going to pull him into a shadowy world where trust was a rare and precious commodity, where friends could be foes, and a misstep could cost a life. But Danny had been Tucker's partner for years. If anyone would understand, if anyone would stand by her, it was him. When she arrived, she took a moment to steady herself before knocking on the door. After a few tense seconds, Danny opened it, his face softening with surprise and concern when he saw her. "Margaret," he said, stepping aside to let her in. "I wasn't expecting you. Is everything all right?" She walked past him into the living room, clutching Tucker's notebook close to her chest. "Danny, I found something that I think will explain why Tucker died. But I need your help." Danny's face grew serious, his brow furrowing as he took a seat across from her. "What did you find?" Margaret took a deep breath, opening the notebook to the page where Tucker had written about the Velvet Fox. She handed it to Danny, watching as he read, his eyes narrowing with each word. "The Velvet Fox," he murmured, tracing the underlined name with his finger. "I've heard this name before, but only in whispers. Some of the guys used to joke about it, like it was some kind of ghost story or urban legend. But Tucker thought this was real." Margaret nodded. "More than that. He was investigating this person, or organization, or whatever it is, when he died. And he left me this notebook." "Danny, Tucker thought the Velvet Fox was connected to corruption in the department, that some officers were working with him. He didn't know who to trust." Danny closed the notebook and looked at her, his eyes dark with anger and sorrow. "That makes sense. I always thought Tucker's death was too convenient. A man like him doesn't just walk into a situation blind. If he was killed, it was because someone wanted him silenced." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine at Danny's words, but she forced herself to stay focused. "There's more. A little girl named Ilara. Tucker was protecting her. She's the one who told me about the Velvet Fox and where he might be hiding. She said there's an abandoned factory by the river, and Tucker took her there once to show her how dangerous it was. I think it's a front for whatever operation the Velvet Fox is running." Danny leaned back, folding his arms across his chest as he processed the information. "An abandoned factory. I know the place. It's been empty for years, or at least that's what everyone thinks. But if Tucker was onto something, then we need to check it out. Margaret's heart leaped with a mix of fear and relief. Will you help me, Danny? I can't do this alone. He looked her straight in the eye, his voice firm. Of course I'll help you. Tucker was my partner, my friend. If he was fighting something this dark, then it's my duty to finish what he started. But we need to be careful, Margaret. If what you're saying is true, then we're dealing with people who have no problem silencing those who get in their way. They spent the next few hours planning their approach. Danny knew the factory's layout well. He had been one of the officers called to investigate the fire that had closed it down years ago. The structure had been partially damaged, with most of its equipment left untouched, rusting and gathering dust in the years that followed. If the Velvet Fox was operating out of there, it would be easy to hide illegal activities among the forgotten machines and darkened halls. Their plan was simple but risky. They would go to the factory at night, under the cover of darkness. Danny would carry a concealed weapon, just in case, though they hoped to avoid any confrontation. Their goal was to gather information, to confirm the factory's use as a hideout or base, and if possible, to find anything that might link Tucker's death to the Velvet Fox's operation. As night fell, Margaret felt the weight of what Leia had pressed down on her. She returned home to prepare, grabbing a flashlight, a small notebook, and her cell phone, making sure it was fully charged. She wore dark clothing, hoping it would help her blend into the shadows. She felt like a stranger in her own skin, a widow turned investigator, a woman on a mission fueled by love and grief. Danny picked her up just after midnight, his face grim as they drove to the outskirts of town. The roads were empty, the city asleep, oblivious to the secrets festering in its underbelly. When they reached the old factory, they parked a distance away and approached on foot, moving slowly, their footsteps muffled by the soft earth. The factory loomed in the distance, its structure dark and imposing against the night sky. The remnants of the fire had left parts of it gutted, with shattered windows and charred walls that looked like the bones of some long-dead beast. As they got closer, Margaret noticed that the gates, though rusted, were slightly ajar. Danny glanced at her, his expression tense, and she nodded, signaling that she was ready. They slipped through the gates, moving quietly along the perimeter, careful to stay out of sight. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay, mingling with the faintest hint of smoke that seemed to linger from the fire all those years ago. Margaret's heart pounded as they approached the building's entrance, a dark doorway framed by cracked concrete. Danny held up a hand, signaling for her to stop. He pointed to the ground, and Margaret's eyes followed his gesture, landing on a set of fresh footprints in the dirt. Someone had been here recently, possibly that very night. They exchanged a look, and Danny mouthed, "Careful." They slipped inside, the darkness swallowing them whole. Danny flicked on a small flashlight, casting a narrow beam that illuminated their path. The interior of the factory was as desolate as Margaret had imagined, with abandoned machinery lining the walls, their metal surfaces covered in layers of dust and grime. Broken glass crunched underfoot, and the echo of their footsteps seemed to carry through the vast, empty space. As they moved deeper into the building, Margaret became aware of a faint humming sound, a low, steady vibration that seemed to emanate from somewhere below. She exchanged a questioning glance with Danny, who nodded, his face set with determination. The sound was a clue, a sign that the factory was not as abandoned as it appeared. They followed the noise down a series of stairwells, descending into the bowels of the building. The air grew colder, the smell of mildew intensifying as they reached what appeared to be a basement level. Danny's flashlight illuminated a long hallway lined with doors, each one closed and covered in rust. At the end of the hallway was a larger door, reinforced with heavy metal, the kind that would have been used to secure valuable equipment. Margaret's pulse quickened as they approached the door, the humming sound growing louder. Danny reached for the handle, but before he could open it, they heard voices from the other side, muffled but unmistakably human. He motioned for Margaret to step back, and they pressed themselves against the wall, listening. The voices grew clearer, revealing snippets of conversation. Shipments delayed. The boss won't be happy. Doesn't matter. As long as we keep things quiet, no one will suspect a thing. Margaret's heart pounded. She could feel Danny's tension beside her. His jaw clenched as he processed the information. The men on the other side of the door were discussing something secretive, something that confirmed their suspicions about the factory's true purpose. Danny leaned in close, whispering, "We need evidence. If we can get a recording, we might be able to bring this to the authorities." Margaret nodded, pulling out her cell phone. She set it to record, holding it close to the door as they listened. The men continued their conversation, talking about shipments, payments, and a figure referred to only as the Fox. The Velvet Fox. Her husband had been right. This wasn't just a criminal operation. It was a network, a complex web of corruption that extended beyond what she had imagined. Tucker had stumbled onto something massive, something that had cost him his life. Suddenly, the voices stopped, and the sound of footsteps echoed from the other side. Danny grabbed Margaret's arm, pulling her back as they retreated down the hallway, hiding behind a large piece of rusted machinery. The door opened, and two men stepped out, their faces cast in shadow as they walked down the hallway, their footsteps echoing in the silence. They waited until the men had passed before slipping back into the hallway, inching closer to the door. Danny reached for the handle, opening it just enough to peer inside. He motioned for Margaret to join him, and she looked over his shoulder, her breath catching at the sight before her. The room was filled with crates, stacked haphazardly against the walls, some marked with strange symbols and others labeled with names she didn't recognize. In the center of the room was a table covered in maps, documents, and photographs. Margaret squinted, her eyes widening as she recognized one of the photographs. It was Tucker, standing outside the police station, his face partially obscured, but unmistakably him. She felt a surge of anger, a white-hot fury that threatened to consume her. They had been watching him, tracking him. He had been a target long before his death, marked by the Velvet Fox and his network. And now, here she was, standing in the heart of the operation that had taken him from her. Danny reached for his phone, snapping pictures of the room's contents, documenting every detail. Margaret watched, her chest tight with both fear and determination. This was their evidence, the proof they needed to expose the Velvet Fox and his network. But as they turned to leave, a shadow fell across the doorway. Margaret froze, her heart pounding as she looked up to see a figure standing in the entrance. The man's face was hidden in shadow, but his voice was cold and menacing. "Going somewhere." In that moment, Margaret realized that they had been found, and the fight for justice had just become a fight for survival. The trap tightens. The figure in the doorway stepped forward, his silhouette growing clearer as the dim light from the hallway spilled into the room. He was tall, with a muscular build, dressed in dark clothes that seemed to blend into the shadows. His face was sharp and expressionless, eyes cold as they fixed on Margaret and Danny. He looked like a man who had seen things, done things, and wasn't afraid of doing more if necessary. Danny instinctively moved in front of Margaret, shielding her with his body. She could see his hand drifting slowly toward his concealed firearm, his fingers twitching as he prepared for the worst. The man gave a humorless smile. "You two shouldn't be here," he said in a voice as smooth as it was menacing. "Especially not with a camera." He nodded toward Danny's phone, which was still partially visible in his hand. Margaret's heart raced, but she forced herself to stand her ground. They were here for Tucker. They were here for the truth. She couldn't allow fear to make her back down now, not when they were so close to uncovering the secrets that had led to her husband's death. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice steadier than she felt. "Are you the Velvet Fox?" The man laughed, the sound low and mocking. "The Velvet Fox? Is that what Tucker called him?" "No, ma'am. I'm just one of his messengers. But you're in no position to be asking questions." His smile faded, replaced by a look of cold contempt. "You've stumbled into something much bigger than you can handle. And now, well, Now I have to decide what to do with you." Danny's grip on his gun tightened, and he took a step forward, his voice calm but firm. "We're leaving. Now, you're not going to stop us." The man raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "And what makes you think you'll make it out of here?" He took a step closer, his gaze flicking to Margaret. "Especially her." Margaret felt a shiver run down her spine, but she clenched her fists, refusing to show any weakness. "I don't know what kind of operation you're running here," she said, "but I know you killed my husband to keep it secret. And I swear I'm not going to let you get away with it." The man's face twisted into a sneer. "Your husband was a fool. He thought he could take us down alone. He didn't understand who he was dealing with. And neither do you. This isn't just some petty crime ring. This is power, control. We are the shadow behind the scenes, and you too. Well, you're just flies caught in our web." Margaret's pulse pounded in her ears, a mixture of rage and terror flooding her veins. She glanced at Danny, who was inching his hand closer to his gun, his gaze never leaving the man in front of them. She could see the determination in his eyes, the resolve that had kept him standing beside her, even as the danger mounted. Without another word, Danny pulled his gun, aiming it directly at the man's chest. "Move," he ordered, his voice low and dangerous. "Or I swear, I'll put a bullet in you right here." The man's expression darkened, his smile vanishing. He took a small step back, lifting his hands in mock surrender, though his eyes remained icy and calculating. "All right, officer," he drawled. "You've made your point, but you'll regret this. The fox doesn't forgive, or forget." Danny didn't respond. He gestured for Margaret to move, keeping his gun trained on the man as they backed toward the doorway. Margaret's heart hammered as they slipped past him, exiting the room and stepping into the dim hallway. The factory's eerie silence pressed in around them, broken only by the faint, ominous hum of machinery in the distance. They moved quickly, Danny leading the way as they navigated the darkened corridors, each footstep echoing in the cavernous space. Margaret clutched her bag tightly, her mind racing with everything they had just learned. The Velvet Fox was more than just a criminal. He was a puppet master, a figure pulling strings from the shadows, weaving a web of corruption that extended far beyond what she had imagined. As they neared the exit, the sound of footsteps echoed behind them, growing louder with each passing second. Margaret glanced over her shoulder, her breath catching as she saw a group of men emerging from the darkness, their expressions grim and menacing. "Run," Danny hissed, grabbing her hand and pulling her forward. They sprinted down the hallway, their footsteps pounding against the cold concrete floor. Margaret's lungs burned as she struggled to keep up with Danny, her heart racing with both fear and adrenaline. The men's footsteps grew closer, the sound reverberating through the empty building, a relentless reminder that they were being hunted. They reached the entrance, bursting through the doors and out into the cool night air. Danny didn't stop, leading her around the side of the building, where they ducked behind a pile of rusted metal and debris, panting heavily as they tried to catch their breath. "We can't stay here," Danny whispered, his gaze darting around the area. "They'll find us." Margaret nodded, her mind racing. They had to get out of the factory grounds, back to the car, back to safety. But the men were close, their voices drifting through the night as they searched for them, their shadows flickering across the ground in the dim light. Danny pulled out his phone, quickly typing a message and sending it. Margaret frowned, her voice barely a whisper. "Who are you messaging?" "A friend of mine," Danny replied, his voice tense. "Someone I trust. We're going to need help if we want to bring this to light. I sent him the photos we took, just in case we don't make it out of here." Margaret felt a surge of gratitude toward him, mixed with a deep sadness. He was risking everything, just like Tucker had. She knew the cost of such loyalty, the sacrifices that came with standing up against corruption. And she knew that, in that moment, Danny was more than a friend. He was an ally, someone willing to walk into the darkness beside her. The sound of footsteps drew closer, and Danny motioned for her to stay low. They crept along the side of the building, moving carefully, every noise amplified by the stillness of the night. Margaret's heart pounded as they made their way toward the fence, a faint glimmer of hope sparking within her. If they could reach the car, they might just have a chance to escape. But as they rounded the corner, they froze, their hopes dashed. A group of men stood between them and the fence, their expressions hard and unyielding. The leader of the group, the same man who had confronted them inside, gave them a chilling smile. "Did you really think you could just walk away?" He sneered, his eyes glinting with malice. "This isn't some game, Mrs. Scott. This is survival of the fittest. And you," he trailed off, his gaze shifting to Danny, "you should have stayed out of this. You've made a mistake aligning yourself with her." Danny raised his gun again, his jaw set with determination. "I don't make mistakes," he replied coldly. "And I'm not leaving without her." The man's smile faded, replaced by a look of pure hatred. "So be it," he snarled, nodding to his men. In an instant, they rushed forward, and Danny fired, the gunshots echoing through the night. Margaret felt herself pulled to the ground as Danny shielded her, his body blocking her from the line of fire. She clung to him, her heart pounding, terror surging through her veins as chaos erupted around them. Danny fired again, his movements quick and precise. But they were outnumbered. The men closed in, their faces twisted with anger and determination. One of them lunged forward, grabbing Danny's arm, and they struggled, the gun falling from his grip and clattering to the ground. Margaret scrambled to her feet, searching desperately for anything she could use as a weapon. Her hand closed around a piece of broken metal, sharp and jagged, and she raised it, her hand shaking as she prepared to defend herself. "Stay back," she shouted, her voice wavering but fierce. The men hesitated, their expressions shifting as they sized her up. But the leader only smirked, taking a step forward. "You're brave, I'll give you that. But bravery won't save you." Before he could move closer, the sound of sirens filled the air, cutting through the night like a beacon of hope. Margaret's heart leaped, a surge of relief flooding her as she realized Danny's friend had come through. Help was on the way. The men froze, their expressions shifting from confidence to alarm. The leader cursed under his breath, shooting Danny and Margaret a murderous glare before signaling to his men. "We're leaving," he growled. "But don't think this is over. You're marked now. Both of you." With that, they turned and disappeared into the darkness, their footsteps fading as they fled into the shadows. Margaret and Danny stood there, breathless and shaken, as the police cars pulled up, their lights casting an eerie glow over the factory grounds. A familiar figure stepped out of one of the cars, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a serious expression. He approached them, his gaze sharp and questioning. "Danny," he said, nodding in acknowledgement. "You all right?" Danny nodded, his face pale but resolute. "Thanks for coming, Mike. We found something here, something big. We'll need to go over everything, but this could be what we need to expose the Velvet Fox." Mike's gaze shifted to Margaret, his eyes filled with respect and sympathy. "Mrs. Scott, you're a brave woman. What you've done tonight, it takes courage." Margaret managed a small, weary smile. "I had to know the truth," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "For Tucker, for everything he believed in." They spent the next few hours giving their statements, recounting everything they had seen and heard, sharing the photos and recordings they had gathered. Margaret's heart ached with exhaustion, but she felt a glimmer of hope. They had the evidence. They had the truth. And now, with the help of those who still believed in justice, they might just have a chance to bring down the Velvet Fox. As dawn broke over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Margaret stood by the side of the road, watching as the last of the police cars drove away. Danny stood beside her, his face weary but determined. "We did it," he said softly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Tucker would be proud." Margaret nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek as she gazed into the rising sun. "This is just the beginning," she murmured. "The truth is out there now. And Tucker's spirit can finally rest." Danny smiled, and they stood in silence, the weight of the night's events settling over them. They had faced the darkness together, and though the battle was far from over, they had taken the first step toward justice. The shadow of the velvet fox still loomed over them, but Margaret knew one thing for certain. She would not stop until her husband's name was cleared, until his legacy was one of honor, not disgrace. And with allies like Danny and Mike by her side, she knew she would succeed, no matter the cost. The light of justice. The days that followed were a whirlwind of investigations, interviews, and revelations. Margaret barely had time to catch her breath as the wheels of justice, finally set into motion, picked up speed, uncovering layer after layer of the corruption that had infected her town. Every time she thought they had reached the heart of it, a new name, a new connection, emerged, revealing just how deeply the Velvet Fox's network had penetrated. Mike, the detective Danny had called for backup, proved to be a crucial ally. He was one of the few officers left in the department who hadn't been compromised, and he was just as determined as Margaret and Danny to bring down the Velvet Fox. With his position in the force, Mike was able to pull strings and gather a team of trustworthy officers who would work outside the usual channels, keeping the investigation as secret as possible. The Velvet Fox's web of influence was vast, but so was their resolve. Margaret became the silent heart of the investigation. She spent hours at the station, combing through evidence, analyzing documents, and poring over surveillance footage that Mike had managed to obtain. Her once quiet life had become a maze of late nights, long meetings, and whispered conversations. But despite the exhaustion, she felt more alive than she had in years. Tucker's presence lingered in her mind, like a gentle hand on her shoulder, guiding her forward. Danny was with her every step of the way. They had grown close through the ordeal, bound together by grief, loyalty, and a shared sense of purpose. He became her rock, supporting her when the weight of it all threatened to pull her under. She would catch him staring at her sometimes, a soft sadness in his eyes, as if he were mourning the life they had all lost because of Tucker's death. But in those quiet moments, she would reach out, give his hand a reassuring squeeze, and they would press on. As the days turned to weeks, their efforts began to bear fruit. They uncovered financial records that revealed bribes paid to officers, politicians, even local business owners. Margaret had always known that Tucker's death had involved more than a few bad actors, but the sheer scale of the operation shocked her. The Velvet Fox had been meticulous, ruthless, and extraordinarily well-funded. Whoever he was, he had orchestrated a vast empire of deceit and greed that reached into the highest levels of local power. Finally, after nearly a month of tireless work, they tracked down a lead that could change everything. One of the names that kept appearing in the financial documents was that of a man named Victor Langston, a wealthy entrepreneur who had donated millions to city infrastructure and youth programs. On the surface, Langston appeared to be a model citizen, but their investigation revealed he was far from it. He was, in fact, the Velvet Fox's financial backer, the man who ensured that the money kept flowing, silencing anyone who got too close. When they brought Langston in for questioning, he was smooth, charming, and utterly unflappable. He denied everything, laughing off the accusations with a casual arrogance that made Margaret's blood boil. But as the evidence continued to mount, his confidence began to crack. Finally, after hours of relentless interrogation, he admitted that he knew the Velvet Fox, but claimed he'd been coerced, forced into laundering money to avoid being implicated in other illegal activities. It was a weak excuse, one that neither Margaret nor the investigators believed, but it gave them a vital clue: the name of a location where he had supposedly met the Velvet Fox in person. That location turned out to be a luxurious estate on the outskirts of town, hidden behind high walls and a sprawling garden. It was an unusual place for someone like the Velvet Fox to operate from, too visible, too exposed. But as they investigated further, they realized it was the perfect disguise. No one would suspect that an elegant mansion, frequently rented out for weddings and charity events, could be the nerve center of a criminal empire. It took a week to secure a warrant, but once they had it, the team moved quickly, planning a raid on the estate. Margaret wasn't allowed to be part of the operation, but she waited at the station with bated breath, pacing the floors as the hours dragged on. She felt a strange sense of anticipation mixed with dread, as if she were standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting to see if she would fall or finally reach solid ground. When the call came through, she held her breath, listening to Mike's voice over the line. "We've got him," he said, his tone grim but triumphant. "The Velvet Fox is in custody." A wave of relief swept over her, and she sank into a chair, her hands shaking as she tried to process the news. They had done it. After months of relentless pursuit, they had finally caught the man who had taken Tucker from her, the man who had stained her husband's name and shattered her life. But when Margaret arrived at the station to see the man for herself, she was unprepared for what she saw. The Velvet Fox was sitting in an interrogation room, handcuffed to the table, his face an eerie mask of calm. He was older than she'd expected, perhaps in his mid-50s, with silver hair slicked back and a steely glint in his eyes. He wore a tailored suit, his posture relaxed as if he were sitting in a boardroom rather than a police station. As Margaret watched through the glass, a cold realization settled over her. This man, the one who had orchestrated so much pain, looked utterly ordinary. He didn't have the menacing presence she'd imagined, the aura of a villain from a storybook. He looked like someone you might pass on the street without a second thought, a reminder that evil often wore the most unassuming masks. When he noticed her standing there, he turned his gaze toward her, and for a brief moment their eyes met. He smiled, a chilling, self-assured smile, and Margaret felt a surge of anger rise within her. This was the man who had stolen her husband's life, and now, here he was, sitting calmly as though he were untouchable. Mike appeared beside her, his expression unreadable. "Do you want to go in?" Margaret hesitated, then nodded. She needed to look him in the eye, to confront the man who had destroyed everything she held dear. Taking a deep breath, she entered the interrogation room, closing the door softly behind her. The Velvet Fox watched her with mild interest, his smile widening. "So, you're the famous Mrs. Scott," he said smoothly. "I've heard quite a bit about you." Margaret's hands clenched into fists, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I'm sure you have," she replied, her voice steady. "After all, you took everything from me. My husband, my peace, even my faith in this town. But now it's over. You can't hide behind shadows anymore." He laughed, a soft, mocking sound. "You think this is over? Mrs. Scott, you've barely scratched the surface. For every man you lock up, 10 more will rise to take his place. That's the beauty of power. It's never truly contained." Margaret's gaze hardened. "I don't care how many of you there are. We'll keep fighting, exposing every last one of you until this town is free of your poison. You may think you're invincible, but you're just a man, and men like you fall." The Velvet Fox's smile faded, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. "Your husband thought he could bring me down too. Look where it got him." The words struck her like a physical blow, but she refused to let him see her pain. "Tucker died a hero," she said, her voice filled with quiet defiance. "And because of him, your empire is crumbling. You might have silenced him, but his legacy will live on. Every family that you've hurt, every life you've destroyed, will find justice." The Velvet Fox's eyes narrowed, his demeanor darkening. "You're a stubborn woman, Mrs. Scott. I almost admire it. But stubbornness won't save you. You've made powerful enemies tonight." She leaned forward, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Good. Let them come. I'm not afraid anymore." With that, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving him alone with his anger. As she closed the door behind her, she felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. She had faced the man who had taken everything from her, and she had not faltered. She had spoken for Tucker, for all those who had been silenced by the darkness. Outside the interrogation room, Danny was waiting for her, a look of quiet pride on his face. "How are you feeling?" he asked gently. Margaret managed a small smile. "Like I've finally closed a chapter," she replied. "But there's so much work left to do." Danny nodded, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll keep going, Margaret. We'll clean this town up, for Tucker and for everyone else who's been hurt. This isn't the end. It's just the beginning." In the weeks that followed, the case against the Velvet Fox and his network grew stronger. With Langston's cooperation and the mountain of evidence they had gathered, more arrests were made and corrupt officials were exposed. The town began to heal, slowly but surely, as the poison was purged from its veins. Margaret returned to her quiet life, though it was forever changed. She often visited Tucker's grave, bringing fresh flowers and sitting beside him, sharing stories of the progress they were making. She felt his presence with her, a constant source of strength, guiding her forward as she continued to fight for justice. Danny remained a close friend, their bond forged through the fires of their shared battle. They would sometimes sit together in the evenings, reminiscing about Tucker, sharing memories and laughter that helped to ease the ache of loss. One evening, as they watched the sun set over the town, Margaret looked at Danny and said, "He would have been proud of us, you know. He always believed in fighting for what was right, no matter the cost." Danny nodded, his gaze soft. "He'd be proud of you, Margaret. You were his greatest ally, his compass. And now you're carrying on his legacy." Margaret smiled, a warmth spreading through her heart. For the first time since Tucker's death, she felt a sense of closure, a peace that came from knowing she had honored his memory in the truest way possible. As the last rays of sunlight faded, casting the town in a warm golden glow, Margaret knew that Tucker's spirit was finally at rest. She had faced the darkness and emerged stronger, a warrior of light in a world that often seemed consumed by shadows. And though the fight for justice was far from over, she knew that she would never be alone. For Tucker, for Ilara, for everyone who had been hurt by the Velvet Fox's web of lies, Margaret Scott would continue to stand strong, a beacon of hope and resilience, lighting the way for those who came after her.